Welcome to this next video on the risk index. So for many of you, you've probably gone through the previous videos that already have given you a little bit of a taste of understanding the importance of having a variety of calculations for determining disproportionality. This quick video here is really going to touch on one particular formula, which is called a risk index. The idea of a risk index is what it really provides you is an opportunity to explore the rate that an occurrence is present within our specific data that we are looking at. And that's all it does. It just tells us the degree to which this rate of this occurrence is actually present. And it's actually a data point that some of us are very familiar with. So for the sake of sort of just describing to you exactly what this formula is, the idea of this rate of a risk of something, the calculation is really looking at in relation to two particular sort of variables that when we're talking about, especially regarding disproportionality, that we want to look at the rate at which we are looking at the two variables of one particular group as it relates to the overall enrollment pattern. So in this example, the risk index formula, we're going to apply it to the rate at which we have classification rates happening by race ethnicity, meaning, how much classification is happening by particular racial ethnic groups. So the way in which we do that calculation is we would take the total number of students with disabilities in a specific racial or ethnic group and divide that by the total number of students in the same racial ethnic groups and multiply that by 100, right? And that gives us the risk index, right? And the idea, again, we're going to come back to this notion that the rate at which something is happening. Now, what I'm going to show you in the next several slides is I'm going to show you two different ways that you can apply the same formula to determine different types of risk indices, right? And so we're going to start first by what I'm going to call is the risk index as it relates to the specific group, which is the example I just gave in the previous slide in terms of the formula. I'm going to continue that same example here with a sort of a much fuller example of actual data. So what you see here is actually, so first let me orient you to what you're seeing. So the first row is representative of racial ethnic categories. The second row is reflective of the total number of students that are enrolled in the particular school district. The third row reflects the total number of students' disabilities of that by racial ethnic groups. And then the final row is that percentage of risk index that's going to be calculated, right? So the way in which we would do the calculation is we would do, as we just showed in the previous slide, you would take the total number of students' disabilities. We would divide that by the total number of students enrolled and multiply that by 100 to get a particular percentage, right? Now here, as you can see, we're doing it as it relates to a racial ethnic group, meaning what's the risk or what's the rate of the occurrence of classification within a specific racial or ethnic group. In this example, you can see that within Native American student populations, in this example, 0% are having a rate of occurrence of classification as a students with disabilities, right? And that begins to tell one part of the story of disproportionality, right? The rate at which something is occurring. When we fill in the rest of the risk index, you can see here the percentages that show up as it relates to various racial ethnic groups. We can see that our Asian Pacific Islanders, the rate is 10.67%, meaning 10.67% of the total number of Asian Pacific Islander students are identified with a student disability. We move over to Black students where it's 20.35%, which means of all the Black students, 20.35% of the Black students are identified with student disability. We go over to our Hispanic Latinx. They are 19.42%, which means 19% of that population are identified with student disability. We go to white. White students are 18.37%, which means that 18% of all white students are identified. We go to multiracial, which shows that 15% of all multiracial students are identified with a disability. And then finally, the total column, which is reflective of the total enrollment, you have 18%, right? Which means that of the total population of this district, 18% are identified with student disability, right? And that gives us our first risk index. Now, when we look at this, one of the things that we're always mindful of is if we look at these sort of total percentage numbers, we also want to find various means in which we're able to describe these, the ways in which the data is kind of presenting us, right? So it allows us to kind of have various ways to start making, to not only just this provides us an analysis, but then we're going to start making some levels of interpretation, right? And so one of the possible ways that I encourage folks to consider is to potentially sort of look at it by the rate at which this is happening, in looking at it in terms of actual sort of student numbers, right? So one way that I like to look at it is in terms of determining of every X number of students, what number of them is reflective of this specific risk index. So, so here, taking this example from the previous slide, we took the total number. So you'll see, remember, total risk index of the entire district was 18%, which means that nearly 1 in every 5 students in the district has been identified with a disability. Black students, risk index is around 20%. So again, 1 in every 5 Black students in the district has a disability. Latinx is 19%. They're also at 1 in every 5. Our white students are 18%. They are also 1 in every 5. And our Asian Pacific Islander students, their risk index is 10%, which means they're about 1 in every 10 Asian student has a disability. It allows for us to kind of see it in a different vein in terms of being able to now sort of really consider, how this is reflective of, of actual sort of student populations, and being able to kind of make further analyses and interpretations around sort of the potential understandings that we have. Now, I mentioned before, there's 2 ways in which we can apply the same formula, right? And so the first example I gave you was looking within the group, right? Being able to determine the percentage of that specific group that's experienced patterns of a risk index, right? The other way that we can also do it is by looking at it by a specific category. So in this example, our category of interest is obviously the students' disabilities, meaning what's the rate of occurrence that students' disabilities is happening by racial ethnic groups, right? And here we're going to use the exact same formula, right? So we're going to start with, again, the total number of students' disabilities of that specific group. And we're going to divide it by the total number of students' disabilities this time. So it should be 0 divided by 1272 times 100 gives us 0%, right? Which means of the total number of students with disabilities in this particular example, 0% are students that identify as Native American. So when we fill in, we will see the complete sort of example here of the percentage of students with disabilities by race or ethnic groups. So what does this mean? So as we go from left to right, our Asian Pacific Islander students, they're 9.20%, which means of the total number of students with disabilities, 9% identify as Asian Pacific Islander, 41.5% identify as Black students, 34.5% identify as Latinx, 11.7% identify as white, and 3% identify as multiracial, right? So both of these ways of looking at risk index are critical for us, right? They provide us an opportunity to start laying the tracks and understanding. What I like to say is it's kind of helping us tell the story of our patterns of disproportionality. As you already learned regarding the relative risk ratio, which lets you know the likelihood something's happened, a risk index tied with the relative risk ratio allows us to complete a little bit more of the story. In particular, being able to tell the story as to what does it mean for a specific group to have a percentage, an overall percentage of that population to experience disproportionality, as well as being able to see how that group is faring when we just look within a specific category, like students with disabilities. I hope you found this very helpful in terms of understanding how risk index is paramount for telling your disproportionality story. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.